I am Jeff Luther, and the host of your new favorite podcast, the Inspector Alliance. This is where we'll peel back the curtain and get behind successful service industry businesses to see just what makes them tick. We're going to focus around the home inspection business. That's what I've built. I've owned it for a little over 20 years now. But we'll also include other service businesses that might parallel ours so we can learn more. And the more we know, the better off we are, right? All right, we are back again with another exciting episode of the Inspector Alliance. Welcome back. Glad to be here. So we've talked a little bit about interviewing and about training, and there's something else I wanted to touch on since we are doing most of this around the service industry and specifically the home inspection industry. I wanted to backtrack just a little bit. Training was a big bottleneck for my company for a while, so we talked about that. And given that this is geared towards that early process in business building, service business, and home inspection business, I want to discuss the employee versus contractor topic. It can be a little bit sensitive. They might seem the same, almost interchangeable in terms, but very different in how they are paid. Tax law sees them very differently. The contractor, or even a subcontractor, some people call them subcontractors, but a sub is a subcontractor of a contractor. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But tax law sees them differently, and contractor status is typically used in the service industry, even for the consulting service, I'm going to use the word avoid, and I don't mean that negatively, but to avoid that tax liability, to reduce your tax liability. How about that? It's a tax benefit. So I'd like to address a couple of things, but let's start with just kind of a general difference between the two from a very high level. A contractor, okay, that's someone who owns a business and takes on contract work, who is considered self-employed. Right. So that's probably most of the folks listening, probably most of the folks listening to this podcast, and then our particular home inspection industry as well. Contractor is generally the person who signs the initial contract with the client, who's responsible for managing and completing any work. So if you thought about like a sole proprietor, a one-man shop, so to speak, in the home inspection business, that would be the perfect example of a contractor. In a traditional sense, a contractor's job might include sales, getting more contracts, right? Maybe delegating work, overseeing administrative tasks, invoicing, managing client relationships, handling complaints, right? Completing the work, performing duties associated with the service business that they own. A contractor may hire subs, might hire employees depending on the services that they're offering. Think about the traditional term of contractor in the home building industry. We have a contractor, right? He is going to contract the house. He hires what is always referred to as subs. He hires the electricians. He hires the plumbers. He hires HVAC contractor. That is a contractor hiring subcontractors. The biggest advantage to use contractors, the biggest advantage, particularly in the service business, is because they're responsible for their own tax liability. That's why there's a big advantage here for, let's say, a home inspection company to hire inspectors on a 1099 or contractor basis, because the home inspection company then just pays out that fee associated with the service at the time of service, kind of pay as paid, and they don't have that tax liability for that contractor, that employee. An employee works for an employer on a consistent and permanent basis. They can be either full-time or part-time. An employee is not considered self-employed, and their employer is responsible for those things, like in some instances responsible for health benefits, vacation, sick days, how you get your job done, your work supplies, your staplers, your staples, your paper, all your work supplies, all your equipment, as well as deducting the taxes from their pay. Now, when they deduct taxes from their pay, a portion of that is paid by the employer and a portion of that is paid by the employee. So you have a larger tax liability. It's not that folks are out there trying to dodge the deduction. They're not trying to dodge anything. Sorry. It's not they're trying to not pay that deduction. The idea is to get your tax liability as low as possible so you avoid that portion of the payroll tax or the FICA tax from the employer. An employee is generally not able to accept certain jobs or reject certain jobs. This is your job, whereas a subcontractor can accept or reject any job that's offered. So we'll continue to use the inspector as an example, but say there's an inspection on Tuesday at 2 o'clock and they don't want to do it, they just don't do it, or they take their name off the schedule, however that works. But employees generally cannot do that. Usually they must complete any work assigned to them by an employer. In return, they're paid an hourly or a salaried wage. So kind of in summary, the contractor, the general rule is that an individual is an independent contractor if the payer has the right to control or direct only the result of the work that's being done and not how it's done. What does that mean exactly? Basically, if you're only responsible for the grass finally being installed or cut, or the report finally being written, or the AC unit finally being installed, if you're only responsible for that end result, then most likely you could be categorized as a contractor. Ultimately, you're not an independent contractor if you perform services that can be controlled by the employer. What will be done and how is it going to be done? This applies even if you're given like the freedom of action, like you have latitude in kind of the freedom of how you want to do it. If you want to work from 1 to 7, or if you want to work from 8 to 12, you're still considered an employee. What matters is that the employer has the legal right to control the details of how the services are performed. So let's look at our examples, like installing the grass or cutting the grass, right? It'd be very difficult to pin someone down on how they do it. How are they going to cut that grass? I mean, you can cut it in circles, do whatever you want, right? As long as the end result is the grass is cut. Now, of course, there's going to be certain patterns that you do it, but you can do all sorts of things in between and then end on that pattern if you want. So this one could probably be either. I could say you would be a subcontractor or an employee. The AC unit, probably the same way, just install it. I mean, it has to work, right? But of course, that's kind of how does it have to work? It just has to work per manufacturer specifications. It could be difficult to specify the how it be installed piece. So I think, again, that could be contractor or employee. We'll look at the example of writing a report. It'd be hard to identify that as a contractor, right? What type of report? What's the time frame? When does it have to be done? What's needed in the report? What are we supposed to discover? What are we supposed to disclose? What are we supposed to actually report on? The report format, the length of the report, whose name is going to be on the report, who's it by, what's the intention to the report? There's not a lot of freedom in this one. It would be tough to say that's a contract position because you're going to have certain items that you have to identify, how they're going to be identified, what tools you use to identify them, the format of the report, how long it's got to be, how short it has to be. If it's coming from a company, what company name is going to be on there? All of those things, what information is in the general section. So that would be tough to say that that's a contract position. And these are my opinions, of course. And there's a disclaimer coming up. Check with your accounting firm, your CPA, all of those things. But here is exactly how the IRS views it. This comes directly from their website. For federal employment tax purposes, the usual common law rules are applicable to determine if a worker is an independent contractor or an employee. Under the common law, you must examine the relationship between the worker and the business. You should consider all evidence of the degree of control and independence in this relationship. The facts that provide this evidence fall into 3 categories: behavioral control, financial control, and the relationship of the parties. So behavioral control, that's kind of the big one that we talked about. That covers the facts that show if the business has a right to direct and control what work is accomplished and how it's done. Again, we'll use the home inspection company. The home inspection scenario, home inspector. How is it done? We have specific instructions. We have protocol. We have processes that are written. We have a process on every piece of the home inspection that our inspectors are required to follow. We do our own training in-house, minimum of 6 weeks. So we train how we want our folks doing that inspection. There are other means as well. Getting the inspection done, it has to be done a certain way. We start in a certain section of the house. We do certain things at the electrical panel. We do certain things at the AC unit. Those things are requirements. There are no gray areas there. They are not allowed the latitude to say, well, I'm not going to pull this panel cover today. They're not allowed the latitude to say, well, I'm not going to inspect this roof today, unless, of course, there's something prohibiting that. And then, again, if there's something prohibiting a section of the report, they have an obligation to the company to indicate why that section of the inspection is not being done. So financial control covers facts that show if the business has a right to direct or control the financial and business aspects of the worker's job. This includes the extent to which the worker has unreimbursed expenses. Basically, does the contractor have control if it's at a profit or a loss, or does the employee have control if it's at a profit or a loss? So if someone wants to do work for a fee less than what it would cost to get the work done, then they have financial control. If they don't want to do that work for less than profit at a loss, then they do not have financial control. So it boils down to basically the company that hires the contractor is the one that's setting the price in the home inspection business. Whereas in a contract position, if a contractor building a house has a rough estimate of what the AC system is going to be, or HVAC system for a house is going to be in terms of cost, the HVAC subcontractor still has that latitude or that freedom to adjust that price accordingly, running into difficulties of the job, etc. The extent to which a contractor makes their services available to the relevant market as a whole. Can they market to the entire market? Can they make themselves available to the entire market? And we do that by marketing. I'm twisting my words up there. Home inspection companies typically are not allowed to do that. Most will sign a non-compete or non-solicitation agreement. Whereas, again, we'll look at the contractor, subcontractor in the home building industry. That HVAC contractor can go install AC units for whoever he wants. So in terms of the financial control, I would say in most of the service industry, that financial control, service being service work, plumbers, electricians, folks in that arena, most of the time they're going to fall into the contractor position. Whereas in the consulting service, which I would categorize the home inspection business as a consulting service, probably not. That's probably going to fall more into the employee category, in my opinion. And then we have the relationships of the parties. This covers the facts that show the type of relationship that the parties have or had. This includes written contracts or oral agreements describing the relationship between the parties to create, like a no-compete should be considered again here. Sometimes this is a no solicitation agreement. I know some companies that have a training agreement with an attached fee. Now, this might work in the plumbing business. Let's say you hire a plumber as a subcontractor, and as part of that agreement, you will agree that they're a subcontractor to you, and they can sub to anybody else, but they will be sub to you for a given period of time, and you will do all of their training. Now, they can go out and do that service with other contractors or even homeowners, whomever they want, as long as they provide a minimum to you. Whereas if you sign some type of no compete or no solicitation agreement, in most instances in the consulting service, you don't want your competitors using that same consultant that you have. Whether the business provides the worker with the employee type benefits, such as insurance, retirement plan, vacation pay, sick pay, in that contract position, typically that is not provided. And sometimes in the employee position, it's not provided, but that's a good way to look at it. If you're getting those benefits, you might be considered an employee. The permanency of the relationship, and then the extent to which services performed by the worker are a key aspect of the regular business of the company. So in terms of the home builder, again, for instance, that HVAC contractor, that really isn't pertinent to the regular business of that company on a whole. Now, the HVAC system is part of that business with regularity, but there's all other facets of the contractors that are a big part of that, all other facets of the subcontractor world that are a big part of that contractor's business. So we're going to dial it down a little bit and narrow it down a little bit. I guess extend our focus. So if we look at the home inspection business specifically, let's go to behavioral control. The appointment is set up with a client at a specific address, typically at a specific time. The inspector uses the tools that are needed to get the job done based on the requirements of the company. For example, does that company provide thermal imaging? If so, then that inspector would be required to carry a thermal imaging camera. They would have to have a tool to perform based on the needs or the requirements of the employer or of the company, which in my opinion makes them an employee of the company. I guess the conclusion here is in the service industry, that's a pretty broad range of outcomes of the job a person is hired to do. I think specifically when it comes to the consulting service, the results become more specific than a contractor position, and having the benefit of the lack of the tax liability of the employer as opposed to a contractor is probably borderline. I'll explain it this way. So you're driving down the road and you're maybe messing with your phone, or you look away for a second, and as you start to run off, you have those rigid, or the ridges along the side of the road that start to hum real loud to let you know, hey, we need to get it back on the lane. So I would say in the consulting service business, using contractors as opposed to employees probably gets you maybe even as far as the guardrail, where you're starting bumping up against the guardrail and maybe need to go back into your lane. Of course, check with your accounting firm. You'll always get a clearer answer from them, and understand too, your accounting firm, your CPA, as well as your bookkeeper, they're always going to err on the side of being more conservative, and do what's comfortable. For me to sit here and say that it's wrong to have contractors in a consulting service business is not my intention. It's not what I want to do. My opinion is I think that it's much safer to have them as employees. I think you follow the IRS guidelines, and that kind of tells that tale. But also, I think we're all going to kind of do what we think is right and figure out how to best move along. I hope this has been helpful. It's kind of a dull topic, but I think it's an important one as you move through that process. Some of you are even building your inspection business or your service business at the moment. So I think that's a consideration. A lot of times we don't really think about that until we get to the end of the tax year, and that might be a little bit too late. Hope this has been food for thought. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm having a good time doing this, and click that subscribe button down there at the bottom, and I'll see you next time.